The morning Vivian Hayes arrived at Marcus Bennett's house, with a black Bentley, a lakeside villa deed, and a Swiss watch resting in a blue velvet box. She was certain he would be standing on the porch waiting for her. She had prepared everything. The car had been detailed the night before. The house deed bore his name in clean embossed lettering. The suit she'd ordered, charcoal wool, his exact measurements, hung in a garment bag in the trunk. Her PR team had already drafted the announcement. Hayes Industrial CEO, to wed, the man who'd stood beside her from the beginning. She had even timed the motorcade so they would arrive at the county clerk's office before the morning rush. Vivian Hayes did not leave things to chance. That was, she believed, what made her good at what she did. The convoy rolled to a stop in front of a small brick house in a quiet suburb west of Chicago. Mature oaks stood at the edges of the lawn. A rusted basketball hoop tilted slightly over the driveway. It was the kind of neighborhood where people left their garage doors, cracked in summer, where children still played in the street at dusk. Marcus had never asked for anything larger, and Vivian had always considered that a kind of personal modesty she respected without quite understanding. She stepped out of the car. The morning was cool and gray. Her heels clicked across the front walk, and she noticed immediately that there was no music, no flowers on the door, no movement behind the curtains. She raised her hand to knock, but before her knuckle reached the wood, the door opened from the inside. An older woman stood there. Marcus's neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Dorothy Carr, who had looked in on Leah more times than either of them could count over the years. Dorothy's expression was careful and kind, in the way of someone who has agreed to deliver difficult news and has prepared herself accordingly. She handed Vivian a white envelope. "Miss Hayes," Dorothy said. "Marcus left early this morning." Vivian stared at the envelope. Left for where? He didn't say. Behind Vivian, Lucas Grant made a quiet sound that was almost a laugh. He had ridden in the second car, and stood now, with his hands in his coat pockets, surveying the modest yard, with the detached ease of someone who had never been impressed by anything that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. "He's making a point," Lucas said pleasantly. "Men like Marcus need to be coaxed. He'll call by noon." Vivian didn't respond. She stepped past Dorothy into the house. The living room was quieter than she remembered. A row of photographs that had once lined the shelf above the television. A young Marcus in work clothes. Leah, at various stages of childhood. One of Vivian and Marcus at a company dinner 4 years ago. Were gone. The mug he used every morning, the one with the small crack along the handle that he'd never replaced because he said ceramic, was gone from the dish rack. The stack of industry journals he kept beside the armchair had been cleared away. The room held the particular quality of a space that had been carefully, methodically unpacked. On the kitchen table, 3 objects remained: an engagement ring, a cell phone with the SIM card removed, and a folded letter. Vivian picked up the letter. Marcus's handwriting was neat and unhurried, the same penmanship she'd seen on distribution reports and margin projections and budget amendments across 7 years of working alongside the man. "Vivian, I kept my word to your father for as long as I could. I stayed when you doubted me. I stayed quiet when others called me a man without the right credentials. I tried to protect the company, even when you took away my ability to protect it properly." She read on. "But last night, Leah asked me something I couldn't answer. She asked how many more times I planned to choose your company, before I chose to stay alive for her." Vivian's hand went still. "So this time, I'm choosing my daughter. I'm choosing treatment. I'm choosing to leave the place that taught me to forget I was a person. Don't come looking for me if the only reason is to win." Her phone rang before she had fully folded the letter back along its crease. A voice from the finance department, frantic and slightly breathless, was already speaking before she could say hello. The new import tax designation had gone through overnight. Tariffs on a critical component category had jumped significantly. 3 major clients had initiated cancellations that morning. And Lucas, the voice told her, had moved the bulk of the company's operating reserves into international investment positions that couldn't be liquidated quickly. The operating account was nearly empty. Vivian stood in the middle of the small, nearly bare kitchen and did not move. For the first time in years, there was no one behind her to correct the math. 300 miles north, in a Milwaukee hospital in Nick Bay, a man with steady hands and tired eyes was signing his name on a registration form. His daughter sat beside him in a plastic chair, her nursing school lanyard still around her neck, her jaw set against the tears she had decided she would not cry in front of the admissions staff. This is the story of what it cost to lose Marcus Bennett, and what it cost him to finally stop paying. Marcus had been with Hayes Industrial for 12 years before Vivian Hayes took over the company, and for 7 of those years, he had held the place together with the kind of institutional knowledge that doesn't appear in any business school curriculum. He knew which suppliers would hold a line of credit through a rough quarter and which ones needed payment within 15 days, or they'd quietly begin routing product elsewhere. He knew which warehouse foreman had to be called directly when a shipment fell off the tracking system, because they understood their own inventory in ways the software didn't. He knew the specific failure points in the domestic distribution network the way a structural engineer knows which bolts in a bridge bear the most load. He had not come to that knowledge easily. Marcus Bennett grew up in Cleveland, the second of 4 children, and paid for 2 years of community college before transferring to a state university on a combination of loans and work study. He had no family money, no alumni network, and no particular appetite for the kind of social climbing that eased careers along faster than competence usually did. What he had was an unusual ability to see systems, to understand how things connected, where the pressure built, where a single failure could cascade into something much larger. He had worked his way from a floor job at a regional distribution company up through operations management before Hayes Industrial's then regional director offered him a position coordinating Midwest logistics. Richard Hayes, Vivian's father, had noticed Marcus within 6 months. The company was facing its worst liquidity crisis in 2 decades at the time. An over-reliance on a single overseas supply line had left Hayes Industrial exposed when port delays and a currency shift collided in the same quarter. The board was discussing options that ranged from a significant asset sale to a partnership with a larger competitor that would have effectively ended Hayes Industrial as an independent company. Marcus had requested 30 minutes with Richard Hayes directly, bypassing 3 levels of hierarchy to do it. He arrived with a legal pad covered in handwritten projections and a single, clear proposal: rebuild around domestic suppliers, open regional distribution centers close to the customer base, and reduce the company's dependency on any single import corridor. The strategy would cost money up front and require 2 to 3 years of patient execution before the margins improved. It was not flashy. It did not involve any of the terminology that consultants charged significant fees to introduce. Richard listened to the whole thing and said he wanted a formal plan on his desk in 48 hours. The plan worked. Slowly, stubbornly, the way most things that actually work tend to do. Hayes Industrial stabilized, then it grew. Marcus's network of domestic distribution hubs became the structural backbone of the company's reliability, the thing that allowed them to fulfill contracts when competitors were scrambling. Richard promoted him to COO and gave him a 10% equity stake, not as compensation in the conventional sense, but as an acknowledgement that Marcus had earned a real stake in what he'd helped build. 3 years before Marcus left the house with his SIM card removed and his ring on the table, Richard Hayes had died of a cardiac event in the spring. He had been 67 years old. In the weeks before his death, when he was still well enough for conversation, but had stopped believing the doctors who told him there was more time, he had asked Marcus to come to the hospital. Marcus remembered the room, the quality of the afternoon light through the blinds, the sound of monitors in the hallway. Richard had looked smaller in that bed than Marcus had ever seen him. This man who had filled a boardroom simply by walking into it now seemed to occupy the space with a kind of careful deliberateness as though every gesture required intention. Richard had taken his hand. "I know Vivian is going to make mistakes," he said. "She's brilliant, and she's scared, and those two things together can do damage. If there comes a time when she hurts you, don't leave immediately. She hasn't learned yet how to hold on to people worth holding." He paused. "But if she asks you to become someone you're not in order to stay, then you leave. You hear me? You leave and you don't look back." Marcus had said he understood. He had also made a second promise, the one that Richard had not asked for, but that Marcus had offered anyway. That he would do everything in his power to keep Hayes Industrial intact. To protect what Richard had spent his life building. It was the kind of promise men make when they are standing at a bedside and cannot think of any other form of fidelity to offer. He had not yet learned at that moment how much that promise would cost him. Leah Bennett had grown up watching her father treat every obligation like a load-bearing wall. If it held something up, you didn't remove it until you understood what would fall. She had watched him work the numbers on the kitchen table at midnight, watched him take calls on weekends, and during school plays and on the single vacations they had managed. A 4-day trip to the Tennessee Smokies when she was 15, where he'd spent one full afternoon on his phone in the parking lot of a trailhead, working through a supplier dispute that couldn't wait. She did not resent him for it. That distinction mattered to her. She understood the difference between a father who had checked out and a father who was trying to keep things from falling apart. Marcus had always come back. He had always shown up, even when late, even when visibly exhausted. He had sat through her nursing school orientation, with a fever he hadn't mentioned until after the ceremony. And when she'd driven him to urgent care afterward, he had apologized for the timing as though the fever were a scheduling failure. That was Marcus Bennett. He apologized for being sick. She had chosen nursing, in part, for reasons she had never fully articulated to him. Because someone in the family needed to know when a body was telling the truth, and Marcus was constitutionally incapable of listening to his own. So when he called her from the hospital waiting room, after the banquet, when she heard the flatness in his voice, the deliberate, measured quality he used when he was controlling something, she already knew. She had been waiting for that call for 2 years. Marcus had collapsed at the banquet, celebrating Lucas Grant's appointment as Chief Strategy Officer. It had happened this way. Lucas had poured a second glass of wine for Marcus, with the smooth ceremony of a man who understood that public refusal is a form of surrender. Marcus had declined once. Vivian, seated across the table from him, had asked him not to make it uncomfortable. He had drunk the glass. The pain had been immediate and significant. Marcus had stood from the table and walked toward the back of the restaurant with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has decided he will not cause a scene. He had made it as far as the service corridor before his legs gave out. The glass he'd clipped on the way down had left a small cut on Lucas's hand. Lucas had pressed his palm to a napkin and accepted the sympathetic attention of the table, while Noah Mills, the CFO, shouted for someone to call emergency services. In the ambulance, Marcus had asked Noah to keep it quiet. He was not thinking of himself. He was thinking of what a health crisis would do to whatever leverage he still had in convincing Vivian that the company's new direction was wrong. At the hospital, when preliminary results came back, and the attending physician used words that required clarification, the kind of words that prompt a follow-up appointment and a discussion about options and timelines, Marcus had thought very carefully about whom to call first. He called Vivian. She was in her office with Lucas. "I'm busy," she said. "Make it quick." Marcus held the phone for a moment, listening to the ambient sounds of the hospital corridor. Then he said there was nothing urgent, and he ended the call. He lay on the examination table and looked at the ceiling and tried to calculate what he had promised, and what he still had the capacity to fulfill. The fluorescent light hummed above him. Outside the curtain, a doctor spoke softly to a family about next steps. Marcus closed his eyes and thought about Richard Hayes, and about Leah, and about the ring in his coat pocket, And somewhere in the geometry of those three things, something shifted. 4 days after Marcus was discharged from the Chicago hospital, with a folder of referrals he had not shared with anyone, Vivian Hayes signed the order revoking his equity stake. Lucas had prepared the argument carefully, timed it for a moment when Vivian was under particular pressure from a board member who had begun asking questions about the offshore restructuring plan. The argument Lucas made was precise and targeted. Marcus's equity represented a structural threat to Vivian's authority. As long as he held 10%, he was not merely her partner, but a party with formal standing. And formal standing, Lucas suggested with the confidence of someone who had given this speech before, was the mechanism through which influence calcified into resistance. Vivian knew, somewhere beneath the logic of it, that her father had intended the equity as recognition. She knew it had been earned. She signed the order at 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, and she used the phrase governance realignment in the memo to the board because she could not bring herself to write what it actually was. She did not tell Marcus directly. He found out through a notification from the company's legal department. He was sitting in his car in the parking structure when he read it. He sat there for a few minutes, both hands on the wheel, looking at the concrete wall in front of him. Then he drove home. Leah was there when he walked in. She had come from Milwaukee after Noah called her, and she had been sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea she hadn't touched, reading the test results that Marcus had left in the inner pocket of his winter coat without realizing she would find them. She didn't cry when she heard the door. She didn't get up. She waited until Marcus had set his keys on the counter and stood with his back to the room for a moment, the way he always did when he was working out how to talk about something. "How long have you known?" she asked. He turned around. He saw the folder on the table and understood she had read it. "A few weeks," he said. "I was managing things." Managing. She said the word the way she repeated incorrect dosage instructions from a patient who was about to hurt themselves. "Dad, the surgeon said if you wait past..." "I know what the surgeon said. Then why haven't you scheduled it?" He sat down across from her. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. He looked at his hands on the table. The calluses from the early warehouse years, the faint scar across his right thumb from a dock cleat when he was 26, the pale ring of skin where his watch usually sat. "Because the company isn't stable," he said. "If I go in for surgery now, I'm out for weeks. The import tariff situation is about to hit, and Lucas doesn't understand how to stop." He stopped. Leah leaned forward. Her voice didn't break. She had a nurse's voice now, not cold but calibrated. The voice of someone who had learned to carry difficult information without letting it spill. "Dad, you were in the emergency room 3 weeks ago. You called me from an ambulance and then hung up before I answered. Mom has been gone for 14 years, and you are the only parent I have. So I need you to tell me honestly. How many more times are you going to choose their company before you choose to be alive for me?" Marcus opened his mouth and found he had nothing to say. He thought about Richard. He thought about what the promise had looked like, in practice, over 7 years. The evening flights, the missed dinners, the single vacation interrupted by a supplier dispute in a parking lot. He thought about all the times he had told himself, one more quarter, one more restructure, one more negotiation, and then I'll rest. That night, Marcus wrote the letter. He wrote it at the kitchen table, in the same unhurried script he used for everything, and when he was finished he read it once, folded it in half, and left it where Vivian would find it. He removed the SIM card from the company phone and set it beside the ring. He carried 2 boxes of documents and personal files to Leah's car. He took the small framed photograph of Leah at 8 years old that had sat on his desk at Hayes Industrial for the past decade. He left the engineering journals. He left the coffee mug with the cracked handle. He did not leave a forwarding address. At 4 in the morning, while the suburb was still dark and the Bentley that would arrive 6 hours later was sitting clean and detailed in a private garage on the north side of Chicago, Marcus Bennett and his daughter drove north on the interstate toward Milwaukee. Leah drove. Marcus slept in the passenger seat for the first time she could remember in years. Hayes Industrial did not collapse all at once. It came apart the way Marcus had warned Vivian it would, piece by piece, along the fault lines that had been created by dismantling things that looked costly but functioned as load-bearing infrastructure. Lucas moved quickly once Marcus was gone. Within 2 weeks, he had closed 3 of the domestic distribution centers, redirecting the lease payments and operational budgets toward the international repositioning plan he'd been selling since his first day. He eliminated overtime pay across the warehouse staff, reclassified several full-time positions to contract status, and dismissed the logistics managers who had the most seniority. The ones who knew the system best, which Lucas experienced as the ones most likely to push back. The workforce contracted. The institutional memory left with it. When the federal import tariff announcement came, a significant increase on a category of components that Hayes Industrial moved in large volume. The domestic distribution network that had once allowed the company to reroute around port delays no longer existed. There was nothing to absorb the shock. Orders that depended on delivery commitments the company could no longer honor began to unravel. Clients called the main office and were put on hold. The shipping software showed inventory in locations it couldn't reach on time, and nowhere near the locations that needed it. 3 clients showed up in person to the corporate office, which had not happened in the building's history, and asked for their deposit money back. Vivian called finance. The operating account was not empty, exactly, but it was close enough to empty that the number looked like a mistake. Lucas had moved the bulk of available capital into international investment vehicles under the umbrella of the offshore restructuring plan, positions that required a minimum hold period before liquidation was possible. He had not mentioned this in the board presentation. The memo that had flagged it as a risk had, somehow, not appeared in the materials distributed to the full board. That memo had been written by Noah Mills, who had been fired by Vivian 3 months earlier for opposing the closure of the distribution centers too loudly. Vivian sat in her office on a Friday afternoon and looked out the window at the city and tried to understand how she had gotten here. She thought about the morning she had signed the equity revocation order and the way Marcus had looked at her in the hallway after the board meeting where Lucas had been appointed, and she thought about the letter folded in her desk drawer that she had read twice, and told herself she would think about later. She had been thinking about it later for weeks. Raymond Shaw appeared at Hayes Industrial's main entrance on a Tuesday morning without an appointment. He was 56 years old, a man of deliberate movements and a Tennessee inflection that he deployed to considerable effect in negotiations, and he had been brought into the conversation about Hayes Industrial's partnership opportunities by a mutual acquaintance who did not know that Raymond and Lucas Grant had already met, and that the meeting had not gone well. Raymond had heard about Marcus through Hayes Industrial's supply chain over the years. The name came up in conversations with other Midwest operators, the way competent people's names do, not loudly, but reliably. He had also had a direct experience with Marcus 8 years earlier, during a contract dispute that Marcus had resolved in Hayes's favor, but done so without demolishing Shaw components in the process. He had offered Raymond a licensing arrangement that kept the Tennessee plant running when it might otherwise have folded. Raymond had not forgotten it. When Lucas met Raymond in the boardroom and referred to Marcus as an operational holdover, unsuited to the company's global ambitions, Raymond set down his coffee cup with a deliberateness that silenced the room. "The man who kept this company alive when it should have fallen apart," Raymond said. "And you're calling him a holdover?" Vivian attempted to redirect. Raymond was already picking up his briefcase. "When you're ready to operate a real supply chain again," he said at the door, "you know how to reach me, but not through him." Vivian stood in the empty boardroom after he left and heard Lucas telling her that Raymond was likely acting on behalf of a competitor, and that this kind of emotional manipulation from veteran operators was common. She looked at Lucas, his posture, his untroubled expression, his absolute certainty. And she thought that she had heard all of this before. She had heard it from herself. Noah Mills drove to Milwaukee, without telling anyone at the company where he was going. He found Marcus in a rental apartment 2 blocks from the hospital, sitting at a kitchen table with a laptop, a notepad, and a phone that was ringing more than a recovering man should allow. Leah opened the door and looked at Noah with an expression that communicated precisely what she thought about the situation. 20 minutes, she said. And he eats before you leave. Noah sat across from Marcus, and Marcus listened to the complete picture. The tariff exposure, the drained operating accounts, the Kessler International deal that Lucas had structured in a way that would allow the fund to acquire Hayes Industrial's core assets at a distressed price if the company defaulted on its debt covenants. Marcus was quiet for a while after Noah finished. He's not incompetent, Marcus said. He's doing exactly what he came to do. I know, Noah said. And so do about 60 people in operations who are about to lose their jobs. Marcus looked at the window. The Milwaukee light was flat and gray. He thought about the 60 people, and then he thought about the people behind the 60 people. The households, the second incomes, the health coverage, the retirement accounts tied to the company's stock. He said he wasn't going back. I'm not asking you to go back, Noah said. I'm asking you to help me save the people who are still there. The line was thin, but Marcus understood the distinction. He had drawn it himself. He set 4 conditions. He would not return to the building. He would not meet with Vivian. He would not accept any executive designation. Every communication would flow through Noah and the company's independent legal counsel with full documentation so that there was no ambiguity about what he was doing and why. Then he opened the notepad and started writing. The plan had 4 components, each one designed to stop a specific bleeding point. First, liquidate the underperforming international positions that Lucas had not yet touched. Use the freed capital to stabilize the payroll account and cover the outstanding supplier payments. Second, reactivate 3 of the closed distribution centers on emergency lease extensions. Marcus knew the landlords personally and knew which ones would work with them. Third, contact Raymond Shaw directly and ask him to return to the table, not on behalf of Hayes Industrial, but as a supplier relationship that predated Lucas Grant's involvement. Fourth, compile the suppressed risk memo, the transfer records, and the Kessler International term sheet into a single document package, and deliver it to the board's independent directors. He worked through it in 4 days. Leah sat across from him for most of those 4 days. She timed his meals and his medication, and forced him to stop working every 2 hours for 15 minutes, standing in the kitchen doorway with a glass of water, and a patience that was more formidable than any argument. She did not ask him to stop. She understood why he was doing it. She simply refused to let him destroy himself in the doing. Raymond Shaw took Marcus's call on the second ring. I figured you'd call eventually, Raymond said. I'm not calling for Hayes Industrial, Marcus said. I'm calling for the people in the Tennessee corridor and the Ohio plants who are going to lose their contracts if this goes sideways. I know why you're calling, Marcus. A pause. What do you need? When the plan began to produce results, when the payroll account stabilized, when 2 of the 3 distribution centers came back online, when the first client who had initiated a cancellation agreed to hold, the board's independent directors called an emergency session. Noah presented the documentation package. The Kessler term sheet, when read aloud in the context of the suppressed risk memo, produced a silence in the boardroom that lasted nearly a full minute. Lucas Grant was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. His access to the company's financial systems was revoked that afternoon. Kessler International, whose representatives had been waiting for a triggering default event that now would not come, issued a withdrawal notice 3 days later. Vivian found out that Marcus was behind the recovery when Raymond called her personally to tell her. She drove to Milwaukee that same day. Vivian had not been to Milwaukee before. She drove herself, no security, no PR coordinator, no assistant sending texts from the back seat. She parked in a hospital visitor's lot and sat in the car for 10 minutes before she went inside. She found out Marcus had been readmitted 2 hours earlier. A hemorrhage, manageable, but serious. He was being stabilized before the surgical with the procedure he had been supposed to schedule weeks ago. Leah was in the hallway outside the room. She was not crying. She stood with her arms at her sides, and her lanyard tucked under her jacket collar, and she looked at Vivian with an expression that had nothing hostile in it. Only tired and certain. You had him for a long time, Leah said. I just have one father. Vivian didn't try to answer that. There was no answer. She sat in a waiting room chair, and Evelyn Hayes found her there 2 hours later, having driven up separately with a storage box that Marcus had left at the house before he departed. Evelyn set the box on the chair beside Vivian, without ceremony. Inside were the originals of the distribution analysis reports Marcus had submitted over 7 years, each one dated, each one stamped with the notation received, and then in most cases, filed without action. There were email threads, printed, organized by date, in which Marcus had flagged the import tariff risk in clear, specific language, months before the announcement. There were the records of Noah's suppressed memo. There was a medical folder showing the hospital visits Marcus had made over the previous 18 months, none of which had resulted in the treatment he needed, because he kept telling the physicians he would follow up after the current project concluded. And there was a letter. It was not addressed to Vivian. It was addressed to Richard Hayes. Vivian read it with Evelyn sitting beside her, neither of them speaking. Marcus had written it in the weeks after the equity revocation, and it had never been sent because there was no address to send it to. He wrote that he had tried to keep his word. He wrote about the specific things he had done to honor the promise, the nights, the flights, the times he'd chosen Hayes Industrial over his own body's insistence that something was wrong. He did not write with anger. He wrote with the careful, slightly formal courtesy of a man who was making a report to someone he respected. Near the end he wrote, I think I may have to choose Leah before I choose the company. I hope you understand that. I think you would. Vivian set the letter on her lap and put her hands over her face and did not try to make any sound presentable. She stayed that way for a long time. When Marcus came out of the initial procedure and was moved to a recovery room, Vivian was allowed in. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been tired for years and has recently accepted it. The monitoring equipment beeped softly. His hands were still. Vivian stood at the foot of the bed and told him everything she planned to restore. The equity, the COO role, all agreements with Kessler voided. Lucas's appointment rescinded, the distribution centers rebuilt. She told him she would step back from the day-to-day operations if that was what it took. She told him she had been afraid, and that Lucas had found that fear and used it, and that she had let him, and that she knew that wasn't an excuse. She told him she loved him. Marcus listened to all of it. His expression was attentive and calm, and slightly sad, in the way of someone who is hearing something they have already processed. When she finished, he said, very quietly, love isn't the thing you remember after everything else stops working. She asked him what she could do. He looked at the window. Outside, the Milwaukee sky was starting to clear. You can fix the company, he said. I believe that. But you can't fix me by pulling me back to where I was. Vivian's voice broke. Marcus did not move toward her. It was not because he was cold. It was because he had learned, slowly and at considerable cost, that yielding to a moment of tenderness was not the same as solving the condition that kept producing those moments. He had loved Vivian Hayes, and he had honored a promise to her father. And he had done both things past the point where a reasonable man would have stopped, and what he had learned from that was that sincerity was not sufficient protection against the thing that kept happening. He was not angry. He was finished. Dr. Hannah Cole came in to check the monitoring readouts and said she would give them a few more minutes. Leah appeared briefly in the doorway window, saw Vivian standing there, and disappeared again without expression. I'm going to be okay, Marcus said. not to reassure Vivian but because it was true and he had decided to believe it. "I know," Vivian said. She was still holding the letter. She left the room and she did not come back. The surgical procedure was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The pre-op paperwork required a designated support contact. Marcus listed Leah. The document was signed by Leah Bennett, nursing student, age 22, in a handwriting that was careful and deliberate and slightly too upright, the way handwriting looks when someone is working to keep it from shaking. The surgery took 4 hours. Dr. Hannah Cole emerged from the operating room with the brisk decisiveness of someone who had done this many times and considered positive outcomes to be the professional baseline rather than the exceptional case. "He did well," she told Leah. "Recovery is going to take time. He needs to stop pretending time is negotiable." Leah said she was aware. "Good," Hannah said, "because the next time he tries to schedule a follow-up around a corporate deadline, I'm going to need you to physically take the phone." Leah said she had already established that protocol. 6 months later, Hayes Industrial existed. That was the accurate word. It existed, it functioned, it had stabilized to a level that the board described in careful language as a controlled recovery posture, which meant that it had not been sold to Kessler International, that the employees had received back pay, and that 2 of the 3 distribution centers Marcus had helped reactivate were now operating under long-term lease agreements. Lucas Grant had been removed and was subject to an ongoing civil proceeding regarding the transfer of company funds. He had retained counsel and issued a statement through that counsel that characterized his tenure at Hayes Industrial as a good-faith, strategic engagement that had been undermined by internal resistance. The board did not comment on the statement. Noah Mills returned as CFO. The first thing he did was reconstruct the domestic distribution documentation that had been scrapped, so that the institutional knowledge lived in the system rather than solely in the memory of the people who had built it. Evelyn Hayes was appointed to lead a restructured board oversight committee, which meant that, for the first time in the company's history, a member of the founding family would be involved in ongoing operational review, rather than functioning solely as a figurehead at annual meetings. She took the role with the resignation of someone who had known it was coming and had simply been waiting for Vivian to need it badly enough to accept the help. Vivian remained CEO. The scope of her authority was narrower than it had been. She was required to present major strategic decisions to the Oversight Committee before implementation. She had fought that condition initially, and then she had stopped fighting it, because the alternative had been demonstrated in some detail, and she was not, at her core, incapable of learning. Raymond Shaw became a strategic partner. The partnership agreement contained specific provisions protecting domestic supply chain positions and prohibiting the offshoring of any production line without board approval and an independent impact assessment. Raymond had insisted on those clauses. His lawyers had flagged them as unusually specific for a commercial partnership agreement. Raymond told his lawyers they were not sufficiently familiar with the history. Marcus did not return. He rented an apartment in Milwaukee near the hospital where Leah did her clinical rotations. He opened a consulting practice, a very small one, with a deliberately small sign on the door and a client list he kept manageable by declining anything that required evening calls or weekend availability. He worked with mid-sized manufacturers and regional distributors, most of them companies that had survived a crisis of some kind and needed someone who understood what systems looked like when they were about to fail. He went to bed at a reasonable hour. He did not drink at client dinners. He kept his follow-up appointments. Leah's nursing graduation was held on a Saturday in late May at a large university hall, with high windows and folding chairs arranged in precise rows. The ceremony ran long, the way graduation ceremonies do. Several speeches were delivered. Various institutional honors were announced, and then the names were called. Marcus sat in the front row in a dark blazer he had bought 2 weeks earlier, slightly too large because he had lost weight during treatment and hadn't fully recalibrated his sense of his own size. He looked, to anyone who noticed, like a man attending to something important. When Leah's name was called and she walked across the stage, she did not look at the audience until she was holding the folder. Then she looked directly at the front row, and she found him immediately, because he was in the exact seat she had told him to be in, and he was there on time, which she had specified in 3 separate reminder texts over the preceding week. She walked down the stage steps and came directly to him. She put her arms around him, the diploma still in her hand, and he held her for a long moment without speaking. "You were on time," she said. "I had a very firm scheduler," he said. She laughed against his shoulder. Vivian was in the back of the hall. She had arrived without announcement, without security, without the kind of supporting infrastructure she typically moved with. She was wearing a dark coat, and she stood near the exit, watching the ceremony with the expression of someone who has earned the right to be in the room, only marginally, and knows it. When the ceremony ended and people began to flow toward the exits, she found Leah near the side corridor. She offered a small envelope. Inside was the documentation for a nursing scholarship. 2 recipients annually, renewable, named the Richard Hayes and Marcus Bennett Scholarship for Nursing Excellence, funded through Hayes Industrial's corporate foundation. Leah looked at the documentation for a moment. "I'll read the terms before I decide anything," she said. Vivian nodded. Something in her expression suggested she had expected that, and that it was the right answer. "You're very much like him," she said. Leah put the envelope in her jacket pocket. "I'll take that as a compliment." Marcus was outside when Vivian found him, standing on the stone steps in the late afternoon. The campus grounds were full of graduates and their families, taking photographs, holding flowers, moving in loose, celebratory clusters through the warm May air. Vivian stood beside him for a moment without speaking. "The company is still standing," she said finally. "The company is standing because people stopped doing the wrong things," he said. She looked at her hands. "Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me?" He was quiet for a moment. Across the lawn, Leah was posing for a photograph with 3 classmates, her diploma held at an angle, laughing at something one of them had said. "Maybe," he said, "but forgiveness doesn't mean going back." Vivian nodded. She had come here knowing he would say something like that. She had come anyway, because there were things that needed to be witnessed, even when the witness cannot change them. She said goodbye. He said it back. She walked to her car alone. Marcus and Leah left the campus as the shadows lengthened across the lawn, when most of the families had dispersed and the folding chairs inside were being stacked by event staff. And the afternoon had the particular quality of a day that has concluded something. Leah's car, the same practical sedan she had driven since her 2nd year of school, was parked 2 blocks away. On the back seat, a bundle of flowers from a classmate's family who had given her extras, 3 medical textbooks she was returning to the library on Monday, and a small wooden box. Leah noticed the box as she was putting the diploma in the back. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. She already knew what was in it. "Why do you still have it?" she asked. Marcus took it from her and looked at it for a moment. Then he set it on the seat beside the textbooks. "To remind myself that some promises shouldn't become a cage," he said. Leah got in the driver's seat. Marcus settled into the passenger seat. She started the car and pulled out of the space, and drove the 2 blocks to the light at the corner of the main road. "So where are we going?" she asked. "Pancakes." Leah glanced at him. "Dad, it's 7 in the evening. I know. That's dinner time. I'm aware. We're having pancakes for dinner? We survived on boxed pasta for 2 years after your mother died. Pancakes is an upgrade." Leah was quiet for a second. Then she laughed, a real laugh. The kind that doesn't require any setup or any particular reason beyond the fact that the person next to you has just said something that captures the whole absurd dignity of having gotten through something hard. Marcus laughed too. The car moved out into the easy Saturday evening traffic of a college town in May, past the coffee shops and the bookstores and the old apartment complexes with their windows open to the warm air. They drove south along the lakeshore road, where the light was going orange across the water, and a few people were still running along the path. There were no boardrooms, there were no dinners where the drinks kept coming whether or not you asked for them. There was no motorcade waiting in front of a house where no one had hung flowers. Marcus Bennett had spent 12 years understanding, in fine operational detail, how a company's systems held together under pressure. He had spent the last 7 of those years believing that his loyalty to a promise made at a bedside was the same thing as integrity. He had learned the difference. Integrity, it turned out, was not the same as endurance. Staying was not automatically honorable. A man could stand at his post until the post itself had become the thing destroying him, and no amount of faithfulness to the original purpose made that sustainable. He had left the ring on the table. He had left the cracked mug. He had left the promise that had been asked of him, and the promise he had added on top of it, the one no one had requested, the one he had offered, because it was the only form of loyalty he knew how to demonstrate in a room that smelled of hospital, antiseptic, and finality. He had chosen his daughter. He had chosen the surgeon's schedule over the next quarterly review. He had chosen pancakes at 7 in the evening on a Saturday in May. The lake sat flat and silver beside the road. Leah drove with one hand on the wheel, unhurried, watching the light change on the water. The box on the back seat rode quietly over the gentle variations in the road surface. Marcus did not look at it. He looked at the lake, and the road ahead, and his daughter beside him, and he thought that the thing Richard Hayes had told him at the end, "If she asks you to become someone you're not, you leave," had taken him 7 years and 1 surgical suite to actually believe. He believed it now. The car rounded the curve where the shore road turned inland, and the lake disappeared behind the tree line, and the signs for the highway interchange came into view. Leah put on the turn signal. "The pancake place is this exit," she said. "I know," Marcus said. "I looked it up." She merged onto the ramp. Marcus settled back into his seat and closed his eyes for a moment, not from fatigue but from something closer to its opposite, the specific quiet of a man who has, at last, put down something very heavy, and is allowing himself to notice what his hands feel like without it. He was going to be all right. That was not a prediction. It was a decision. And this time, unlike every other time, it was one he had made entirely for himself.